London, 1888. A city absolutely drowning in grief. And one man saw an opportunity to grow very rich. Until one very stubborn Scotland Yard inspector decides to prove that ghosts aren't the only things hiding in the dark. Welcome back. Grab a cup of tea. This one involves grieving widows, rubber tubing, and possibly the least romantic man in London. Before we begin, a brief note. Tonight's story is historical fiction, inspired by the real frauds of Victorian spirit photography. The setting, technology, and historical background are authentic, but the characters and events are fictional. London, in 1888. Every family in this city had lost someone. Children to diphtheria, to scarlet fever, to the 1,000 small tragedies of Victorian infant mortality. Husbands to industrial accidents, to war, to the simple bad luck of getting sick in an era when medicine was still mostly guesswork and good intentions. Wives to childbirth, which killed with a regularity that modern minds find genuinely difficult to process. Everyone is mourning someone, and there is no internet, no telephone, no easy comfort available to any of them. Just letters that take days, photographs that fade, and an aching, specific silence where a voice used to be. Into that silence walks a man with a camera. His name is Arthur Penhaligon, and he tells grieving people something they desperately want to hear. He tells them the dead are still here. And for the right fee, never a small one, he can prove it. His camera, he claims, can capture what the naked eye cannot. A face, a hand, a presence hovering at the shoulder of the living, patient and loving, and still there. People pay him extraordinary sums of money for this. Not because they were foolish, but because grief has a way of making impossible things seem reasonable. And most of them walk out of his studio feeling, for the first time since their loss, something close to peace. Which would be a rather lovely story, if it were true. Before we get to Penhaligon, we need to talk about spirit photography. Because it wasn't some fringe curiosity practiced by a handful of eccentrics in backstreet studios, it was an industry, an enormous one. It started, more or less, in America in the 1860s, with a man named William Mumler, who discovered, quite by accident according to him, though nobody in retrospect believes this for a second, that his photographic plates occasionally produced faint, ghostly extra figures alongside his sitters. Double exposures, essentially. Technical errors, artifacts of the wet plate photographic process, the kind of accidental smudge that any competent photographer of the era would recognise immediately. Mumler recognised something else entirely. He recognised an opportunity. He began marketing these accidental smudges as genuine spirit photographs, proof captured on glass that the dead remained among the living. And the timing could not have been more perfect. America had just come through a civil war that had killed roughly 750,000 people. Britain, meanwhile, was in the grip of a spiritualism craze that had been building since the Fox sisters and their supposed rapping spirits back in the 1840s. Queen Victoria herself, still deep in mourning for Prince Albert more than 2 decades after his death, was known to have consulted mediums. If the Queen of England believed the dead could be reached, who was a grieving shopkeeper's widow in Whitechapel to argue? By the 1880s, spirit photography had crossed the Atlantic and set up shop comfortably in London. Dozens of practitioners, studios in respectable neighbourhoods, advertisements in newspapers, tasteful and understated, promising portraits from beyond and communion through the lens. The technology of photography itself was still relatively new, still slightly mysterious to most ordinary people. Long exposures, chemical plates, darkened rooms. The whole process had an air of alchemy about it, even when practiced honestly. It was, in retrospect, the perfect canvas for fraud. New enough to be mysterious, established enough to be trusted, and complicated enough that almost nobody sitting for a portrait understood exactly what was happening inside that camera. Arthur Penhaligon understood exactly what was happening inside his camera, because he was the one making it happen.
Arthur Penhaligon was one of the most sought-after spirit photographers in London. He was in his early 50s, well-dressed in the sombre, respectable way that put grieving clients at ease, rather than the flashy way that might have made them suspicious. He had cultivated, over roughly a decade in the business, an extraordinarily convincing manner, warm without being familiar, sympathetic without being saccharine, professional in a way that suggested science rather than showmanship. He never called himself a medium. That was important to his whole operation. Mediums were, at the time, becoming somewhat suspect in respectable circles. There had been enough exposed frauds, enough embarrassing scandals involving cabinets and trumpets and suspiciously convenient darkness, that the word itself had started to carry a whiff of the disreputable. He called himself a photographer, a scientist almost, a man who had simply discovered, through careful technical experimentation, he would explain, in the gentle, patient tone, that certain photographic processes were capable of capturing what he called residual presence. Not ghosts, exactly. Not in the vulgar sense. Something more refined, more scientific sounding to a Victorian client who wanted to believe in the supernatural, but didn't want to feel foolish about it.
His studio was located on Regent Street. Good address, tasteful frontage, nothing about the exterior to suggest anything untoward. Inside, the front room was arranged like any conventional photography studio of the period. Backdrops, props, a large format camera on its tripod, brass fittings gleaming. The back room, the one his clients rarely saw, the one where the actual work happened, was, as we'll get to shortly, a rather different matter entirely. His method, on the surface, was very simple. A client would come to him, grieving, carrying a photograph or a description of their lost loved one. Penhaligon would conduct what he called a preparatory consultation. Gentle questions, delivered with great sensitivity, about the deceased. Their appearance, their manner, small identifying details that a grieving widow would share freely, never once suspecting she was handing a con artist the raw material for his fraud. Then, some weeks later, the client would return for the actual sitting. Long exposure, dim lighting, and when the plate was developed, a faint but unmistakable, hovering at the sitter's shoulder, would be a face. Sometimes a startling likeness, sometimes vague enough that the grieving client's own desperate hope did the rest of the work, filling in details that weren't really there. Either way, it worked. It worked extraordinarily well, and Arthur Penhaligon had worked it on a great many grieving people for a great deal of money.
Mrs. Eleanor Sterling was a widow of 8 months. She was a woman of genuine, unadorned grief. Her husband, Charles Sterling, had been a successful wool merchant, the kind of solid, comfortable Victorian prosperity that meant Eleanor Sterling was left, on his sudden death from a heart complaint, with a substantial inheritance, and absolutely nobody to share it with. They had been married for 26 years. No children who survived infancy, a detail that made her grief for her husband considerably sharper and more total than it might otherwise have been. He was the whole of her family. She heard about Arthur Penhaligon from a friend at her church, another widow, who spoke of him in hushed, grateful tones. A photographer who could show you your loved one was still watching over you, who had brought her, this friend said, more comfort in one sitting than a year of sermons and sympathy cards combined. Mrs. Sterling was, understandably, desperate for exactly that kind of comfort.
She wrote to Penhaligon's studio. She received a warm, carefully worded reply, inviting her for a preparatory consultation. She attended. She spoke, at length, and through considerable tears, about Charles, his kindness, his particular way of tilting his head when he was thinking, the small gold pin he always wore on his lapel, a gift from his own late father. Penhaligon listened, attentively. He took no notes in her presence. That would have broken the spell entirely. But he remembered every detail with an accuracy that, in retrospect, should perhaps have struck her as slightly unusual.
Some weeks later, she returned for the sitting. 50 guineas changed beforehand, an extraordinary sum, roughly equivalent to what a skilled tradesman might earn in several months of honest work. Mrs. Sterling paid it without hesitation. The sitting took place in dim gaslight, the studio arranged with heavy velvet curtains and an atmosphere of hushed, reverent solemnity. Penhaligon positioned her carefully in the chair, adjusted the lighting with great ceremony, retreated behind the camera and instructed her gently to think of Charles, to hold him in her mind, to be open, he said, to whatever might come through. The plate was exposed, developed some minutes later, and there, faint, but to Mrs. Sterling's grieving eyes unmistakably, was her husband, standing behind her chair, one hand resting near her shoulder, not quite touching, his head tilted in exactly the way she had described. Mrs. Sterling wept for nearly 20 minutes. She left that day, she would later say, feeling something she had not felt since Charles's death. Hope. That should have been the end of it. A grieving woman comforted by a photograph, however fraudulently produced. Painful to think about, perhaps, but not obviously a matter for Scotland Yard. But what happened afterwards changed everything.
Penhaligon, it turned out, did not consider one sitting sufficient. Some weeks after receiving her photograph, Mrs. Sterling received a letter, carefully worded on Penhaligon's studio letterhead, suggesting that the connection established during her sitting was unusually strong, unusually clear, that Charles's presence, in his professional opinion, remained close and active, and that further sessions might allow for something even more remarkable than a photograph, something closer to communication. Mrs. Sterling returned. This second sitting, and the several that followed over the coming months, took place not in the main studio, but in a smaller, more intimate room at the rear of the building. Heavier curtains, dimmer light still, an atmosphere that Penhaligon cultivated with the patience and precision of a man who understood exactly what he was doing. And during these sessions, according to Mrs. Sterling's own later account, she began to hear him, Charles. A voice, faint, muffled, seeming to emerge from somewhere near the velvet curtain behind her chair, was speaking to her. She was certain it was her husband's own manner of speech, his particular phrases, the pet's name he'd used for her, which she had never told anyone, not even the friend who'd recommended Penhaligon in the first place.
The voice told her he loved her and watched over her, and he was, however, not entirely at peace. There was, the voice explained, unfinished business, a debt he'd left unresolved, a concern for her welfare that still troubled him, and Penhaligon, gently, as though this pained him as much as it did her, explained that further contact, further sessions, further assistance in helping Charles find his final rest would require further payment. Mrs. Sterling paid, repeatedly. Over the following months, she handed over, by her own later reckoning, once the full accounting was done, nearly 300 additional guineas. Money for further sittings, money for what Penhaligon described as spiritual materials required to maintain the connection. Money, on one particularly distressing occasion, because the voice had indicated that Charles was struggling,
and required immediate additional assistance to ease his passage. She was, by the spring of 1888, a woman being systematically, cruelly, and very profitably fleeced by a man exploiting the warest grief she had ever experienced, and she had absolutely no idea.
Because the voice sounded exactly like her husband. Because the photograph had captured his face with a precision that felt like proof beyond any reasonable doubt. Because everything about Arthur Penhaligon's manner, his gentleness, his apparent reluctance to discuss money, his air of genuine spiritual seriousness, told her this was real. Her own solicitor, alarmed at the scale of withdrawals from her accounts, asked her directly what the money was being spent on, and it was only when she said it aloud, described it plainly, to a man of business rather than a grieving widow desperate to believe, that something in her own ears, rather less like communion with the dead, and rather more like something else entirely. So, she went to Scotland Yard the following morning. Now, I should introduce you properly to the man who took her case. Inspector Silas Vane was in his mid-40s, precise in his habits, dress, and in his manner of speaking that colleagues found either admirably efficient or faintly exhausting, depending on their own temperament. He did not believe in intuition, in hunches, in the detective's traditional gift for sensing guilt in a suspect's eyes. He believed in what could be measured, weighed, observed directly, repeated reliably, and demonstrated to any reasonable person, regardless of their prior convictions. This made him, by disposition, almost uniquely unsuited to, and uniquely essential for, the case that was about to land on his desk. Vane had, in fact, encountered spirit photography before, a minor case, 2 years earlier, involving a much less sophisticated practitioner, who'd been caught almost immediately through the simple expedient of an assistant selling out his employer for money. Vane had found the whole business, at the time, rather beneath his professional interest. Cheap trickery, preying on the gullible. Distasteful, certainly, but not the kind of intricate criminal puzzle that engaged him.
Mrs. Sterling's case was different, and what made it different, what caught Vane's attention immediately in the flat, was the sheer scale of the sums involved and the audacity of the ongoing extraction. This wasn't a single fraudulent photograph sold once for one payment. This was a systematic, months-long campaign of exploitation, engineered specifically to extract the maximum possible sum from a grieving woman's desperation, repeated indefinitely for as long as she kept believing. Vane read Mrs. Sterling's statement twice. He asked her, with characteristic bluntness, whether she had considered the possibility that the voice she'd heard might have originated from somewhere other than the spirit world. She had not considered this. She found the suggestion initially rather offensive. Vane noted this reaction with professional interest rather than personal irritation. It confirmed something he'd suspected from the moment he opened the file. Whoever was running this operation was very, very good at what he did, which meant catching him in the act would require something more sophisticated than simply arresting him and hoping for a confession. It would require exposing the mechanism itself, in front of witnesses, in a way that left absolutely no room for doubt, ambiguity, or the kind of theatrical explanation that a clever fraudster might use to talk his way free. Vane began to plan exactly how he would do that. Vane's first move was not to visit Penhaligon's studio. It was to visit a chemist supplier, a photographic equipment shop, and, rather unusually for a Scotland Yard inspector, a small workshop belonging to a retired instrument maker he had consulted on previous cases. He needed to understand, first, exactly how a fraud like this was likely constructed, because Vane's entire method rested on a principle he articulated frequently, to the mild irritation of colleagues who preferred more traditional detective work. You cannot expose a trick until you understand precisely how the trick is performed.
he studied everything available on the mechanics of spirit photography, the double exposure technique pioneered by Mumler and his imitators, the use of pre-prepared photographic plates subtly exposed in advance with a faint image, then reused for the genuine sitting, producing the ghostly overlay effect, mirror tricks, hidden assistants positioned behind screens, visible only as faint reflections under precisely controlled lighting. He also, through careful and discreet inquiry among London's community of professional photographers, several of whom were only too happy to discuss the fraudulent practices of a rival, professional jealousy being a wonderfully reliable source of information, learned something specific about Arthur Penhaligon's particular methods. Arthur Penhaligon, it emerged, favoured a technique using pre-cut paper silhouettes, precisely shaped, carefully positioned figures cut from thin, semi-translucent paper mounted on a fine wire frame that could be introduced into the camera's field of view during the long exposure, visible on the developed plate as a faint, ghostly overlay, but invisible to the naked eye of a sitter facing forward, especially in the deliberately dim lighting Penhaligon favoured for his sessions. As for the voice, the detail that made this case so much more disturbing than an ordinary photographic fraud, Vane's inquiries eventually led him to a rather ingenious piece of engineering. A length of rubber tubing, run behind the studio's velvet curtains, connecting the sitting room to an adjoining space where an operator, Penhaligon himself according to Vane's eventual reconstruction, could speak directly into one end of the tube. The rubber dampened and distorted the voice just enough to disguise its true source, while preserving enough of its character that a desperate, grieving listener, primed by weeks of careful psychological preparation, would hear in it exactly what she wanted to hear. It was, Vane noted in his own case file, with what might have been the closest thing to admiration he permitted himself, an operation of considerable technical sophistication, deployed entirely in the service of a contemptible fraud. Understanding the mechanism, however, was only half the problem. The other half was catching it in the act, in front of reliable witnesses, in a manner that could not be dismissed, explained away, or denied. For that, Vane needed something rather more direct than careful observation. He needed light.
Vane's solution was, in its essentials, simple, though it took considerable engineering to make it reliable. Magnesium powder, ignited, produces an intensely bright, near instantaneous flash of white light, the standard method of the era for photography in low-light conditions, well understood by any professional photographer, including, of course, Arthur Penhaligon himself. What Vane required was a means of triggering such a flash suddenly, without warning, at precisely the moment when Penhaligon's fraudulent apparatus would be most exposed, the paper silhouette in transit, the wire frame extended. He worked with the instrument maker over several days to construct a compact spring-loaded mechanism, small enough to conceal beneath a coat, simple enough to trigger with a single discrete motion of the hand, and reliable enough that it would not itself fail at the critical moment. A small measure of magnesium powder, held in a shielded compartment, connected to a friction striker released by the spring mechanism. The device, when triggered, would produce a flash bright enough to illuminate an entire room in stark, unforgiving detail, for perhaps half a second, but half a second would be more than sufficient.
Vane tested the mechanism repeatedly in the workshop, refining the trigger action until he was satisfied it could be operated smoothly, silently, and without drawing attention, even in the close and watchful confines of a studio designed specifically to notice anything unusual. He then turned his attention to the second part of his plan, because a flash of light, however bright, revealing however damning a scene, would mean very little without proper witnesses. Vane needed people in that room, reliable people, capable of testifying afterwards to exactly what they had seen, who would not themselves compromise the operation by behaving suspiciously beforehand. He arranged quietly for 2 colleagues to be present as observers, positioned appropriately within the room under the guise of assisting a grieving client's household. He arranged separately for Mrs. Sterling herself to be informed of the plan and asked whether she would be willing to participate in bringing her tormentor to justice. She agreed immediately, and with what Vane's own notes describe as a ferocity of purpose I confess I had not anticipated and found entirely commendable. Grief, it turned out, curdled rather effectively into resolve once a person understood precisely how they had been used. The final piece of the plan required Vane himself to do something considerably outside his usual professional comfort, to walk into Arthur Penhaligon's studio not as a police inspector, but as a client.
Silas Vane wasn't a natural actor, and the prospect of presenting himself convincingly as a grieving father, desperate to make contact with a lost child, required rather more theatrical range than his usual professional toolkit provided. He committed to the role with characteristic thoroughness, nonetheless. He constructed, in consultation with a colleague experienced in undercover work, a plausible identity. A widowed merchant, recently arrived in London from the north of England, grieving the loss of a young son to scarlet fever some 18 months prior. Specific enough to be convincing, ordinary enough to attract no particular suspicion. He rehearsed the details of this fictional grief with the same methodical precision he brought to constructing his mechanical flash apparatus. The boy's name, his age, small identifying details that a genuinely bereaved father might mention in a preparatory consultation, all carefully invented to be plausible without being so specific as to create complications later. He dressed the part. Modest but respectable clothing, appropriate to a merchant of moderate means. He adjusted his usual manner, brisk, precise, faintly clipped, into something softer, more hesitant, more evidently burdened. Whatever doubts Vane had about his performance, Arthur Penhaligon appeared to notice none of them. Penhaligon was, Vane noted afterwards, with something between professional respect and personal distaste, genuinely accomplished in his manner, warm without excess, sympathetic without theatre. I found myself, on several occasions during our conversation, having to consciously remind myself of the purpose of my visit. The sitting itself was arranged for 2 weeks later, in the evening, at Penhaligon's studio. Vane spent the intervening fortnight in final preparation, checking and rechecking the mechanism concealed beneath his coat, confirming the positioning of his 2 colleagues who would attend under separate pretense, and meeting once more with Mrs. Sterling, who had insisted, against Vane's initial reluctance, on being present herself. I would like, she told him, according to his own notes, to see his face when the truth finally arrives. I believe I have earned that much. It was the first time Inspector Vane had seen grief replaced entirely by determination. The evening of the sitting arrived, a warm night in late June 1888, the kind of close, humid London evening that made every room feel slightly airless, regardless of how many windows stood open. Penhaligon's studio, from the street, presented exactly the picture of tasteful respectability it always had. A discreet brass plate by the door, heavy curtains visible through the front windows, drawn against the evening light, nothing to suggest anything untoward to a passer-by. Inside, Vane, in character, subdued, appropriately burdened by his invented grief, was led by Penhaligon himself through the front studio, past the conventional photographic apparatus, the ordinary backdrops, the props that any legitimate photography business might display, and into the smaller rear chamber, where the real work of the evening would take place. The room was, by design, extraordinarily atmospheric. Heavy velvet curtains, deep burgundy, hung floor to ceiling along every wall, absorbing sound and light in equal measure. A single low gas lamp, turned down almost to nothing, cast the room in a deep, uncertain amber gloom. The camera itself sat on its tripod at the far end,
its brass fittings catching what little light there was, giving it an almost ceremonial presence.
The air carried a faint, unplaceable scent, something Vane's notes describe as a mixture of gas, old velvet, and something faintly chemical beneath it, which I attributed, correctly as it transpired, to certain of the photographic materials employed in the fraud. Penhaligon guided his client to a chair positioned before the camera, arranged with quiet, practiced gravity. He spoke softly of the process ahead, the need for stillness, for openness, for the sitter to hold their lost loved one gently in mind and allow whatever might come through to arrive without resistance or fear. He was, Vane noted, extraordinarily good at this. The voice pitched perfectly between warmth and solemnity. The pacing was unhurried, allowing the atmosphere of the room itself to do much of the persuasive work before a single word of supposed spiritual content had even been spoken. Vane's two colleagues, positioned at the rear of the room, under the pretense of assisting with the sitting's arrangements, remained still and watchful. Mrs. Sterling, present at Vane's specific request as a witness who could confirm the fraudulent voice's technique from prior, painful experience, sat quietly to one side, her expression composed, but her eyes fixed intently on the velvet curtain behind the sitter's chair, the very curtain, Vane's investigation had determined, concealing the rubber tube through which the spirit voice would emerge. Penhaligon retreated behind his camera, made the final adjustments to the lens, the plate, the long, careful choreography of the exposure. The gaslight dimmed further at Penhaligon's own quiet instruction to an unseen assistant. The room settled into near total darkness, broken only by the faintest amber glow. And somewhere in that darkness, Silas Vane's hand moved, with practiced discretion, toward the small mechanical device concealed beneath his coat.
The exposure began. Penhaligon, from behind the camera, began speaking in low, measured tones, inviting the spirit world, in the careful, non-specific language he had clearly refined over years of practice, to make itself known, if it wished, to offer comfort to a grieving father if it found him worthy of comfort. Minutes passed. The room remained still, the only sound the faint hiss of the gas lamp and Penhaligon's continued soft invocation. And then, faint, seeming to emerge from somewhere near the heavy velvet curtain behind Vane's chair, a voice. Muffled, distant-sounding, distorted in exactly the manner that a voice passed through rubber tubing and thick fabric would be distorted, though to an untrained ear in a darkened atmospheric room primed by weeks of grief and expectation, it would sound like nothing so much as a voice reaching across an impossible distance. The voice spoke a name, the invented name of Vane's fictional dead son, and Vane, playing his part to the last, allowed himself a sharp, audible intake of breath.
Mrs. Sterling, seated nearby, kept her composure with visible effort. She had heard this before. She recognised, with a fresh wave of quiet fury, the particular cadence of it, the same careful, calculated distortion that had once convinced her that she was hearing her own husband's voice. Penhaligon continued his performance from behind the camera, his own voice now overlapping with the muffled one from the curtain, weaving a careful narrative of comfort and connection, guiding his grieving client gently toward the emotional crescendo of the sitting. The moment, still to come, when the developed plate would reveal the ghostly image itself. Vane, in the near-total darkness, watched Penhaligon's silhouette at the camera with absolute attention, and he saw it exactly as his weeks of research had led him to expect. A slight, deliberate movement of Penhaligon's hand toward the side of the camera housing. The faint, barely perceptible motion of something thin and pale being introduced into the space just behind and above where Vane sat. A shape, in the near darkness, that might have been mistaken by an untrained eye for nothing at all, but which Vane, watching precisely for this moment, recognised immediately as a wire-mounted paper silhouette,
sliding smoothly into position within the camera's frame. The moment had arrived. Vane's hand closed around the small mechanism beneath his coat, and he triggered it. The magnesium ignited with a sharp hiss and a crack of sudden combustion. White light exploded through the room. A stark, blinding light flooded every corner of the chamber in an instant, revealing everything the darkness had so carefully concealed. For a fraction of a second, the room was frozen in that impossible brightness. And there, Arthur Penhaligon was caught, one hand still extended toward the camera housing, holding a thin wire frame from which hung a pale, precisely cut paper silhouette. A figure cut to suggest the vague shape of a standing child, mounted and positioned to drift into the camera's exposure at exactly the calculated moment. The velvet curtain behind Vane's chair, in that same instant of brilliant light, was revealed to be not solid fabric at all, but fabric with a discreet slit, through which a length of pale rubber tubing extended, running back into the darkness of an adjoining space, where, presumably, an assistant, or Penhaligon's own recorded preparation, had been generating the muffled, distorted spirit voice. And the room itself, which had felt, in darkness, ethereal and hushed and heavy with genuine supernatural possibility, was revealed in that single flash to be nothing of the sort.
Wires ran along the skirting boards. A small mirror, angled precisely, sat bracketed to the wall beside the camera, clearly positioned to reflect additional faint light onto the paper silhouette at the crucial moment. The velvet curtains themselves, viewed suddenly in stark white light rather than atmospheric gloom, showed their true condition. Worn, faintly grimy at the edges, stained here and there with what might have been years of accumulated chemical residue from the darkroom work conducted nearby. The whole studio, for one blinding half-second, stood exposed as exactly what it was: a cluttered, mechanical, thoroughly unmagical workshop of fraud. For a moment after the flash, the room existed in a strange, disorienting darkness, the eyes of everyone present struggling to adjust after the sudden brilliance, spots of light still swimming in their vision. Penhaligon, for his part, remained frozen at the camera, the wire and its paper silhouette still extended in his hand, caught in a posture that admitted of no innocent explanation whatsoever. Vane rose from his chair. He spoke, according to his own subsequent account, in a tone he deliberately kept level and unhurried. "Mr. Penhaligon, I am Inspector Silas Vane of Scotland Yard. I believe you'll find the device in your hand rather difficult to explain." Penhaligon, to his credit, attempted composure. He began immediately to construct an explanation. Some apparatus for adjusting lighting conditions, a technical instrument entirely unrelated to any question of spirits or fraud. The kind of confident, immediate deflection that had likely served him well in whatever minor challenges he'd faced over a decade of successful operation. He gestured to his two colleagues, who moved from their positions at the rear of the room, one securing the studio's rear exit, the other beginning, methodically, to document the scene exactly as the flash had revealed it. The paper silhouette, the wire frame, the rubber tubing, the small mirror bracketed beside the camera. And then Vane turned to Mrs. Sterling. "Mrs. Sterling, would you care to confirm for the record whether the voice you heard this evening bears any resemblance to the voice you were told, on numerous previous occasions in this very room, belonged to your late husband?" Mrs. Sterling rose from her chair. She looked, for a long moment, directly at Arthur Penhaligon. "It is the same voice," she said. "I would know it anywhere. I have paid nearly 350 guineas to hear it." Penhaligon, at this, said nothing further. For the first time that evening, the room was truly silent. Word had, by this point, begun to draw a small crowd, a constable summoned from the street outside, a neighbour or two roused by the commotion, gathering with the particular fascination of Victorian Londoners presented with a genuine, unfolding scandal on their own doorstep. Vane used the moment to lay out, plainly and for the benefit of every witness present, exactly what had been happening in this studio for the better part of a decade. He held up the paper silhouette itself, a delicate, precisely cut figure mounted on its thin wire frame, entirely unremarkable once removed from the darkness and atmosphere that had given it such devastating power. "This," he said, "is your ghost, Mrs. Sterling, cut from paper, mounted on wire, introduced into the camera's exposure at precisely the moment calculated to produce the faintest, most suggestible overlay on the developed plate, faint enough that any doubt a grieving mind might raise would be dismissed by hope rather than confirmed by scrutiny."
He gestured to the velvet curtain, now pulled back to reveal the full length of rubber tubing running behind it into the adjoining chamber. "And this," he continued, "is your husband's voice. Not spoken by your husband, who is regrettably beyond speaking to anyone, but by Mr. Penhaligon himself, or a confederate, into one end of this tube, the rubber dampening and distorting the sound just sufficiently to disguise its true source, while permitting enough of its character through that a listener already primed by weeks of careful, deliberate suggestion would hear exactly what she had been led to expect." He turned finally to Penhaligon himself, who stood now in the full, unforgiving light of the studio's restored gas lamps, looking considerably smaller and considerably less impressive than he had appeared in the atmospheric gloom of moments before. "I am not arresting you, Mr. Penhaligon, for claiming to speak with the dead. Whatever your private beliefs on that subject, they are not, strictly speaking, a matter for Scotland Yard. I am arresting you for fraud, for obtaining money under pretences from this woman, and, I have no doubt, from a considerable number of others, through the deliberate and calculated deception you have just been caught performing." The constable stepped forward. Arthur Penhaligon, ghost photographer of Regent Street, was arrested in his own darkened studio, surrounded by the wires, mirrors, and rubber tubing that had, for nearly 10 years, made him a wealthy man. The trial that followed generated considerable interest in the London press. The combination of spiritualism, fraud, and a genuinely theatrical unmasking proving, as these things reliably did, irresistible to a Victorian public with an enormous appetite for exactly this kind of sensational story. The prosecution's case rested almost entirely on the physical evidence recovered from the studio, supported by Inspector Vane's own detailed account of the sitting and its dramatic conclusion. Mrs. Sterling testified with considerable composure, describing in painful detail the months of escalating payments, the voice she had believed absolutely and completely to be her husband's. Several other former clients came forward once the case became public. Women, largely, though not exclusively, who had paid Penhaligon substantial sums over months or years, believing themselves in genuine, ongoing communication with the dead. The total sum extracted from clients over Penhaligon's decade of operation was estimated, by the time the prosecution had finished its accounting, at several thousand guineas. An extraordinary fortune, built entirely on the systematic exploitation of grief.
Penhaligon's defence attempted, with limited success, to argue that he had genuinely believed in his own abilities, that the mechanical apparatus discovered in his studio was merely a technical aid to a real spiritual gift, rather than evidence of deliberate fraud. This argument found little purchase against the physical evidence of calculated engineering, clearly installed with deliberate intent to deceive, rather than accidentally discovered to have some genuine spiritual property. The jury did not take long to reach its verdict.
guilty, on multiple counts of obtaining money under pretenses. Penhaligon was sentenced to several years of penal servitude. This sentence reflected, the judge noted in his remarks, not merely the financial scale of the fraud, but its particular cruelty, the deliberate, sustained exploitation of the most vulnerable emotional state a person could experience.
Spirit photography did not end with Arthur Penhaligon's conviction. Far from it. The practice continued in various forms well into the 20th century, surviving the exposure of Mumler in America, surviving Penhaligon's very public downfall in London, surviving decades of increasingly sophisticated debunking by scientists, magicians, and skeptical investigators. It survived because it was never really about photographic technique. It was about grief and the particular universal human desire to believe that loss is not final, that the people we love remain, in some form, reachable.
Inspector Silas Vane understood this, in his own flat, unsentimental way, better than most. His case notes on the Penhaligon investigation include a passage that reads, remarkably, almost like sympathy from a man not generally given to expressing it. I do not believe Mr. Penhaligon's clients were fools. I believe them to have been people in the grip of a grief so total that they would have accepted almost any comfort offered to them, regardless of its source. The fault lies not with their willingness to believe, but with a man who constructed an elaborate mechanical apparatus for the specific purpose of exploiting that willingness for considerable financial gain. My task was never to disprove the existence of spirits. It was, considerably more simply, to demonstrate that this particular spirit was made of paper and wire, and had been sold to a grieving woman for 50 guineas, with several hundred more extracted from her afterwards through a length of rubber tubing behind a velvet curtain.
Mrs. Sterling, for her part, recovered only a small fraction of the money she'd lost. Penhaligon had spent lavishly, and what remained of his considerable fortune was insufficient to compensate the scale of what he'd taken from dozens of grieving clients over 10 years. But she did receive something else. Something that, by her own account, in a brief interview given to a London newspaper some months after the trial, mattered rather more than the money. I do not believe any longer that Charles spoke to me from beyond the grave, she said. I find that I have made a kind of peace with that. What I could not have made peace with was continuing to believe it, while a man who had never met my husband continued profiting from my grief for as long as I remained willing to pay him. Right, that's the case of Arthur Penhaligon, the ghost photographer of Regent Street. Leave a comment below with what Victorian case you'd like next. And if anyone ever offers to put you in touch with a lost loved one, for a fee, in a very dimly lit room, ask to turn the lights up first. See you next time.